iGlobenews brings global views.
I'd like to welcome our listeners to another episode of iGlobeViews, our weekly video podcast where we discuss world politics and current events. My name is Diana Markov. I am editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org, and today I will be discussing, like every week, with world-renowned China expert Professor Susanne Weigelen-Schwirtzig. Our topic today, Greater Israel. Hello, Suzanne. Greater Israel or Greater Middle East, China's increasing role. And for the record, today is April 16th, 2026. Israel has received a major setback because it has not defeated Iran quickly. Ahead of Donald Trump's Iran deadline on 7th of April 2026, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made an urgent call to the White House. He warned the president against pursuing a ceasefire with Tehran. After the ceasefire was agreed to, Israel sabotaged it by launching the most brutal attack on Lebanon, now dubbed Black Wednesday. Israel killed 357 Lebanese, including women and children. Since Israel launched its war in Lebanon, it has killed over 2,000 Lebanese, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. Netanyahu's far-right government advocates for the creation of a Greater Israel. In order to make this a reality, Israel is pursuing not just the occupation of more land, such as southern Lebanon, but the annexation of Palestinian lands in Gaza and the West Bank. It is also seeking military dominance over large areas of the Middle East in all directions. Israel has occupied and colonized Syria's Golan Heights for nearly 60 years, formally annexing it in 1981. In the past 2 years, Israel has sought to grab more land from Syria. Moreover, Netanyahu is trying to start a civil war between Hezbollah and the Lebanese government. Iran has stood in the way of all these goals. As you yourself have stated in the podcast we recorded 2 weeks ago, the U.S. wants to install as the dominant power in the Middle East Israel. And to do this, you said, Israel must expand its territory, defeat Iran completely, or really weaken it by causing its breakup. Let's be clear. Israel can only realize these grand plans because of U.S. military and political support. Support for Israel in the U.S. has plummeted. 80% of Democrats now have an unfavorable opinion of Israel, and 41% of Republicans share that view. Among young people, these percents are even higher. 60% of Americans oppose the U.S. sending arms to Israel. U.S. Democrat Senator Bernie Sanders is now trying to force the U.S. Senate to vote 2 joint resolutions of disapproval, the only formal mechanism Congress has to block an arms sale to Israel. The first would block the sale of 151.8 million in 1,000-pound bombs, and the second would block 295 million in bulldozers. Sanders stated that these are not defensive weapons, but weapons of ethnic cleansing. Sanders is a Jewish American whose father fled Poland in 1921 to escape poverty and anti-Semitism. Is it time for the U.S. to stop military support for Israel so it cannot use its military power for offensive wars? This would also ensure that Israel cannot sabotage any peace effort by the U.S., as they did last week by viciously attacking Lebanon.
Well, this is a very, very complicated question because I think the situation in the Near East tells us that once tensions between countries have reached the point where they go to war against each other, it is very, very difficult to find a solution, and a solution which will only be to the benefit of one side of the conflict will never be feasible. So the situation in the Near East has now, according to my understanding, reached a point where it is very, very difficult to come up with a solution, especially with a one-sided solution, because if we think of a one-sided solution, which is to the detriment of Israel, the leadership in Israel might come to the conclusion that it is in such a helpless situation that only the use of a nuclear weapon can actually help Israel to survive. And I don't think that any suggestion that goes into this direction or that has the logical consequence that Israel or the leadership in Israel might come to this conclusion is a good solution. So therefore, I think the situation is so complicated that we need to sort of balance out the interests of all actors that are active in this region and try to find a solution that sort of balances out the different interests rather than doing something very much to the detriment of one side and to the benefit of the other side.
Well, this is definitely the direction that China, the other great power, is heading. It has proposed on a 14th of April a 4-point peace plan, and it announced this 4-point peace plan for the Middle East during Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince Sheikh Khaled bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan's visit to China on said 14th of April. Let us remember, Abu Dhabi is the largest of the UAE's 7 emirates. President Xi called for the adherence to the principle of peaceful coexistence, adding that the rule of law cannot be, and I quote him, used when convenient and discarded when not, end of quote. Mm-hmm. According to Chinese media, his plan involves 1, peaceful coexistence and regional security architecture, 2, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, 3, upholding international law, and 4, balancing development and security. Xi has criticized the U.S.-Israeli war as illegal. Trump is expected to visit Beijing in May 2026. How do you interpret Xi's peace proposal? And will there be peace, do you think, with Iran before Trump's visit to China? Since China's trade and other key factors are negatively impacted by the closure and blockade of the Hormuz Strait, will China become more involved in the war in Iran? And how will it involve itself? As a hidden actor or more active? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I think Mr. Xi pronounces 4 different principles, which are so abstract and general that he nearly cannot hurt anybody. And this is part of the diplomacy that China has been pursuing since the beginning of the war in Iran. They try to be able to speak to all sides. So, for example, they talked to the Israel ambassador in Beijing, but they also gave a call to the Israeli defense minister. So they try not only to speak to Iran and not only to speak to the Gulf states, but also to Israel. And by this, they try to show that they actually want to maybe eventually take over the role of a mediator between them. But on the other hand side, it is also quite characteristic of Chinese policies to not come up with very concrete suggestions as to how to solve the problem, because they think that a suggestion how to solve a problem has to be generated from the different actors talking to each other, entering into a dialogue and trying to solve the conflict by talking to each other rather than by fighting against each other. This policy is quite logical and understandable, especially when you look at the situation from the point of view of China not being a regional actor, but obviously an actor from outside the region and an actor that has interests in the region and therefore wants this war to end as soon as possible, but that at the same time cannot really develop leverage in sort of pushing this very complicated situation to a solution that everybody could accept. The fact that China only articulates this very general principles is also a weakness of its trying to sort of voice its opinions and position itself as a mediator for this conflict, because other actors in the region usually hesitate to really ask for China to get involved because they feel that behind these very abstract principles, there might be more concrete policies that China at this moment is actually hiding from the other actors. And therefore, they hesitate to say, okay, let's ask China to come in and help us solve the problem. So this way of sort of getting involved in international conflicts is both a good idea from the Chinese side, but it's also a problem because China, also in the case of Ukraine, has never actually reached a level where it could voice more concrete policies so that certain actors might say, oh, this is a very good idea. And others might say, oh, no, we don't want this. And then China would really have to show how they can sort of help these different actors to finally come to a conclusion which is okay for both sides. So this, I think, is a problem that we might have in mind when we talk about China's role in this conflict. With regard to the war, I think it is very, very difficult to anticipate in which direction this war is actually going. I think that at this moment, everybody is hoping that Donald Trump can go and visit Xi Jinping in Beijing by the end of May. Although I think, when I read Chinese newspapers and when I listen to Chinese TV, I think the expert opinion that is being voiced in Chinese media says that they think that after the ceasefire, actually there will be yet another round of fierce fighting between the different actors in the region. So they don't think that this war has already reached a point where we can proceed from the ceasefire to a peace agreement. And of course, from President Trump's side, he wants to make sure, that we believe that he can end the war the moment he wants to end the war. And that's why for him, it is also convenient and beneficial to define May 24th as the day when he will go and visit Xi Jinping. I don't really believe in this going to be a reality. I think this is more a play or a game they are playing in this moment.
Well, Donald Trump is good in these mind games, if you want to call that. And you never really know what he really is thinking because sometimes he says things that you don't really know if you can take it seriously. I guess always out for some kind of deal. But what is now becoming increasingly clear is that not only are the U.S. and the Iranian positions so far apart from each other, but there is an increasing divergence in public opinion on the war in Iran between the U.S. and in Israel. So between the people in the U.S. and in Israel. According to a recent poll by the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, 61% of Israelis oppose the ceasefire with Iran. 73% said they expect fighting with Iran to restart within the next year. The majority of respondents, namely 69%, said they support continued military action in Lebanon, irrespective of talks between the Lebanese and Israeli governments that began this week in Washington. So, of course, the question is, does Israel want a forever war? And these polls are in stark contrast to those in the U.S. So if we look at those, only 34% of Americans strongly or somewhat support the war on Iran. So that's already 34% compared to Israel's 61%. While most Republicans support the military action, you have 67% there, the majority of Americans, approximately 53%, oppose the war in Iran, with 22% of Democrats specifically naming pro-Israel groups and interests as the primary factor behind the war. An overwhelming majority of Democrats, namely 84%, oppose the war. Only 9% of Democrats are for the war. What both countries have in common is that both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are very unpopular. 70% of Israelis want Netanyahu to resign, and Donald Trump's polling is at an all-time low with a 56% disapproval rating. The way Israel deals with its initiation and pursuing of Iran is also connected to the criminal charges facing Netanyahu once he is no longer Prime Minister of Israel. So this is another reason why Netanyahu would like to prolong the war. Based on these poll numbers, it would have been in Trump's favor to come to a deal with Iran in Pakistan, but the negotiations ended with Vance leaving. the US came with maximum demands, which amounted to a capitulation of Iran. The Iranian 10-point plan was off the table. It is now known that Vance had one, if not more, calls with Netanyahu during the negotiations, and of course with Trump. So, my question to you is, were these negotiations in Islamabad actually serious, or were they doomed to fail from the start?
Well, I think we have to look at those negotiations as a long process. I think many people, when they try to assess the situation after Vice President Vance declared that they had no real result from these negotiations, came to the assessment that under normal conditions, one cannot expect the first round of negotiations already to come to a result. And if you look, for example, at how long it took to end the Vietnam War, you can understand that under normal conditions, especially if they are as complicated as in the Near East, one has to expect these negotiations to take a certain time. And it is very common procedure that when two adversaries meet for the first time, that they have very sharp differences in opinion and that they don't show that they are willing to compromise. It is the result of a longer period of negotiations that maybe finally a result will come up, especially in this situation. Because in the Near East, I think we have not only different opinions about this war, we also have very different assessments of the war. So the US side declares victory, and the Iran side says, our victory is that we have not yet been defeated. So basically, both sides feel that they cannot sort of capitulate, right? Because of obviously, the U.S. feels they are very strong. They have all kinds of results. They destroyed many things in Iran. I think President Trump said the other day that it will take them at least 20 to 30 years to rebuild their country, and so on and so forth. So they feel very strong, and Iran also feels quite strong because they do have some cards in their hands, and they have survived this war for more than 4 weeks now. So from this point of view, one can very well understand that when the two adversaries meet for the first time, and especially as the third adversary was sort of only acting as a hidden actor, so the situation is extremely complicated, and I think nobody should have expected to have a sort of robust result from this first round of negotiation. From the US point of view, I think it is very understandable that President Trump wants to end this war as soon as possible. The war is very costly. The war is not as victorious as he pretends and tells us ever so often. If you look at the situation of the US bases in the Near East, some people say they have 19, other people say they have 13 bases. No matter how many bases they have, most of them have been severely damaged. And this also shows that it is not so easy for the US to actually continue this war without having to pay a very high toll. So, regarding the midterm elections and all these kind of things, the economic implications for the US, it is very understandable that Donald Trump wants to end this war as soon as possible. But if we look at the Israeli side of this conflict, I think we can understand that not only because Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to avoid being taken to court, but also because they feel that their problem has not been solved. And as they have decided to actually solve the problem by military means rather than political means, for them, the idea is as long as we have not solved the problem, we will continue to go to war. So their idea is that they want to continue to go to war. And as you just said, they seem to have the support of the population of Israel for this kind of assessment. So why do they come to this kind of assessment? Well, I think the narrative is, as far as I understand it, and I'm not a specialist in this field, but if I try to understand what is the logic behind all this, it is that Israel feels it is being surrounded by countries that want to destroy Israel. And for that reason, they feel that only if they actually sort of can sort of decide on what kind of policies these countries pursue, can they avoid being sort of the object of politicians in these countries surrounding Israel, which actually want to destroy Israel. And this is the narrative, I think, that then generates this feeling we have to go to war against everybody in our region until they finally understand that we are the most powerful force in this region, and they have to do what we want rather than developing their own policies with the aim of destroying Israel. And I think this is the reason why the population sort of obviously feels that there is no other option for them than continuing war against southern Lebanon, against Iran, but also in the region as such. As they actually sort of have no other vision for a solution of the problem than going to war, they support their leadership in going to war. And this idea is not the idea that Donald Trump pursues, right? And for Iran, I think the option that they can end the war would, of course, be the best option. But at the same time, they are very unsure whether or not they can sign a contract with the US and Israel, and both countries will actually adhere to this contract. So for them, actually staying in a war situation is more secure than going into the direction of a peace from which they don't know whether or not this is something they can regard as a robust peace. And that's why I think the situation is very, very difficult. And it will be very difficult for Donald Trump to sort of develop the kind of leverage he needs in order to force the other two actors into accepting some kind of agreement that, at least for the time being, would create a peace-like situation. And therefore, I must repeat that I don't think that this war will be ended by the end of May. And I doubt that President Trump will go and visit Beijing by the end of May, because although Beijing definitely wants Trump to come and visit, they cannot accept Trump to come and visit Beijing if the war is still going on.
Yes. And what you mentioned before, and also your answer now, brings me to the whole nuclear question, because, of course, this is one of the main things that the United States and Israel are demanding from Iran. And here we see also the double standard of dealing with the nuclear issue versus Israel and Iran, because the U.S. wants to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, but it has allowed, and the world has allowed, Israel to have nuclear capabilities, although it is very ambiguous, but it is quite certain that they have between 80 to maybe even 200 nuclear weapons. Iran, on the other hand, must, according to Trump, totally dismantle its nuclear program. The IAEA has asserted that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Iran is still allowing nuclear safeguard inspections on its nuclear facilities. I'd like to also mention that Israel is not a member of the NPT. Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, which was the Iran nuclear agreement, which Obama had concluded during his first term. And he did this also mainly because of pressure from Israel. We remember that Netanyahu came to the U.S. Congress and had a very passionate speech there regarding this issue. If Trump agrees to allow some low-level enrichment, then many will ask, well, why did you leave the JCPOA in the first place? Because that would have allowed some enrichment. So this is probably, or maybe one of the reasons why he's also pushing for zero enrichment for, I believe, 20 years is now on the table. This demand is inconsistent with rights of states under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. Trump acts like his diktat, we could call it, supersedes the NPT, which allows enrichment up to a certain level under IAEA safeguards. Will China push for a regional security arrangement tied to maybe a nuclear weapons-free zone? This would also, of course, have to include Israel, which will be a big ask. Steps towards establishing such a zone in the Middle East began in the 1960s with Egypt and Iran calling for it via a 1974 joint declaration and United Nations General Assembly resolution. Or other version, Iran will seek, of course, its own nuclear weapons for deterrence. But many are now saying that the Strait of Hormuz is even a better deterrent than nuclear weapons and also gives Iran some income if it can make money from people passing through the straits. So the other question is, should Iran keep the control of the Strait of Hormuz and give in to Trump regarding the issue of enrichment?
I think the whole issue of enrichment is an issue that is being used to give us a reason why. I think it is very interesting to see that this war is a war that has no clear reason why. Today, we are being told this is the reason why. The next day, we are being told that is the reason why. When they start negotiating, sometimes this reason becomes the main reason, and then that reason becomes the main reason. And somehow, I think there are people all around the world who have the feeling that maybe we are not being told what the reason is for that war, right? And it is very interesting that something which seems to be quite open for someone like myself, who is a structural realist and assesses the situation in the region and says, you know what, one of the reasons for this war is that Israel needs to be sort of the dominant force in the region in order for the US to be sure that they have the dominant influence in this region and not Iran, and with Iran, maybe Russia and China, right? So it is very interesting to see that not very many people actually articulate this idea and always go from this one reason to the other that Donald Trump is giving us by his social media platform or by his utterances on Air Force One or whatever, whenever he wants to say something about this. So I think that this idea about enrichment is only used because the US knows that Iran cannot give in on this issue. And for that reason, they can always use this to declare why a negotiation can have a result. So what is this war about? I think this war is about, first of all, defining Israel as the dominant actor in the region. But why do we want, or does the US want Israel to be the dominant actor in the region? Because they want to make sure that Iran is not the dominant actor in the region, because they think if Iran is the dominant actor in the region, the hidden actors behind Iran are two, Russia and China. So with other words, if we go to war against Iran, according to Donald Trump's logic, we are making life really difficult for both Russia and China. And we see that life is being very difficult for Russia and China. And we also see that to a certain degree, the fact that these two countries are also being hit by this war in Iran is sort of always translated into a very interesting story, which says China is the biggest beneficiary of this war. Right? They say China is the biggest beneficiary of this war. And then they also say, no, because with the oil prices rising, the second biggest beneficiary of the war is Russia. So this story is being told time and again without any sort of robust argument behind it. You just tell people that they should think into this direction without giving them sort of arguments why they should think into this direction. And when you try to assess the situation, step by step, you come to the conclusion that maybe, superficially speaking, they have a certain benefit from the situation, but China, for example, is extremely interested in ending the war because they feel that if the war goes on, the world economy will tumble into an enormous crisis. And as China is a country that lives of its exports, and that needs exports to work at least comparatively well for their economy to run comparatively smoothly. So this country is extremely frightened of this war going on. And for them, this is the biggest problem with the war. The fact that, for example, the Abraham Lincoln flight carrier is now being transferred to the Near East opens up maybe an opportunity to go to war against Taiwan. But at this moment, they're not thinking about going to war against Taiwan. They have an enormous problem in trying to solve their economic problems as consequences of this war. So with other words, I think that we are being sort of trained to think that this war in the Near East is only about Iran. But as a matter of fact, it is also about Russia and it's also about China. And Iran is actually the place on earth where you can hit one country and at the same time blow against two other countries that are your main adversaries. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. And this will also sort of maybe decide whether or not Trump is going to leave this war early enough for him to go to Beijing on May 24th. He has to calculate the consequences and whether or not he wants to show a certain amity with China and for that reason try to visit Xi Jinping as early as possible.
So if we look at the world as a chessboard and we have all these various players, we have, of course, the big three players, which is the US, China, and Russia. And then we have Europe, which you a couple of podcasts ago have classified as a middle power, or it should see itself maybe as more of a middle power. But nevertheless, it's not completely irrelevant on the world stage, especially when it comes to economic might. And as this war in Iran progresses and gets more virulent and the economic outfall becomes tougher for everyone involved, we see that the EU is now slowly moving over towards China's position. So we have EU Commission President von der Leyen coming out more or less asking for the war to end and saying you can't have stability in the Middle East when Lebanon goes up in flames. So that's indirectly a statement against Israel, which is actually very unusual for her to make. You have Giorgia Meloni coming out saying that Italy would suspend the renewal of its defense agreement with Israel, which up to now has been automatically renewed every 5 years. Also a very unusual thing to happen. You have France openly criticizing Israel. France, of course, sees itself as some kind of protector nation over Lebanon. It wanted to become involved in protecting Lebanon in the diplomatic resolution to Lebanon, which, of course, did not happen. And last month, Israel halted defense purchases from France after France prevented Israeli aircraft carrying U.S. military equipment from flying through its airspace. Let us also not forget that other countries have also done this. I note Spain, the UK, Germany, and also Austria. Then we have, of course, Pedro Sanchez, who is the most outspoken European critic of President Donald Trump. And he just came back from a visit to China. He was there for 4 days and signed a bunch of bilateral agreements. And he is advocating for a closer relationship between Beijing and the European Union and has secured major investments in Spain from China. And he's also calling on Beijing to become the broker in the Middle East, something that you just mentioned. And very interestingly, a civil petition calling for total suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement for alleged war crimes has reached 1 million signatures across all 27 EU member states. And under EU rules, the European Commission and the European Parliament must now address this request. So are all these developments a sign that Europe is finally becoming independent of the US in its foreign policy, including its relationship with Israel? Let's not forget that when Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe was very quick to place all sorts of sanctions on Russia and stop the purchase of Russian oil? And is Europe moving closer to China?
I think that finally we can observe first steps from the European side towards China. China has been working on this issue for a long time. China has been making lots of interesting propositions for Europe to be able to change its attitude. Just recently, for example, a Chinese human rights activist was released from prison. So China is trying to give all kinds of signals that it wants to sort of reduce all kinds of tensions between China and Europe so that Europe can move more easily towards a policy that is more aligned with China than before. So I think finally it took a very long time for the leading politicians in Europe to understand what Chinese policies were about. And finally, they seem to be understanding that it is a very unfavorable position for Europe sort of to be in conflict with Russia, the US, and China at the same time. This, I think, is very obviously very obvious, and this has been going on for quite some time. And finally, they come to the assessment that maybe they should change this situation. And it is quite interesting to see that the situation in the Near East sort of gives Europe this opportunity to define policies which make sort of create a certain distance to the US, and which at the same time sort of draws Europe a little bit closer to China. I think this is a very interesting development. It is only just in the making, so we shouldn't overestimate the level of agreement that they have already reached. But it is interesting to see that maybe for the last 3-4 weeks, things have been changing a little bit in Brussels. And it will be very interesting to see how Donald Trump and the White House in Washington will react to these moves from Europe. So far, I think that Donald Trump sort of thought that he could play around with Europe, and European politicians have created the impression that they want to be played around with. So it's really an interesting constellation. But maybe slowly but steadily, Donald Trump understands that the situation that he has created by getting involved into the war against Iran is a situation that actually sort of unites all the countries that feel the negative consequences of this war, even though they are not directly involved, so strongly that they simply cannot go with the US anymore. And I think it is very interesting to see that this is something that the US must also calculate, but doesn't seem to be calculating at this moment, that so many countries in the global south are now running into enormous difficulties because they're running out of oil, they're running out of gas, and running out of gas does, for example, in India mean that there are many people who cannot cook anymore because they simply cannot buy the gas they need in order to cook their meals. I mean, this is a really sort of widespread problem. We in Europe, if our gas prices go up and if our oil prices go up, okay, this is something that many people feel that it is very difficult to digest, but we can still cook our meals. But in some countries in the global south, this is a much more pronounced problem. And I think these countries in the global south must fear that if this war goes on, their internal conflicts will become more and more pronounced, and people will simply take to the streets because they have to voice their grievances and their problems more articulately. So the whole world is going to be, in turmoil within the next weeks to come. And everybody will say, the reason why sits in the White House, right? And this implies that we do not need to speak of U.S. isolationism as something that is invented in the U.S., but the U.S. is going to be somewhat isolated more and more from more and more countries around the world, some of them which used to be, very close allies of the US. And this is also something that the White House needs to keep in mind. And I don't know how they want to solve this problem, because maybe this is something that they simply don't really calculate when they decide on their policies, that there are things happening around the world that are maybe beyond their imagination, right? And I think they will have to keep. They will see very soon that the reality will push them into understanding that there are things going on, which not only push Europe away from the US and closer to China, but also other parts of the world.
And maybe things that are beyond their control, which is probably very hard for President Trump to realize. Another thing which was totally beyond his control, and which I guess they didn't expect, was the recent election in Hungary, where people, as you said, did take to the streets in a certain way. They voiced their opinions at the poll, and Viktor Orban suffered a crushing defeat there. Let us not forget that Vance and Rubio, who both want to be the Republican nominee for the next presidential election, traveled to Hungary and actively supported Orban in his campaign. So the fact that he was defeated so crushingly now, I think 2/3, the new leader will have a 2/3 majority now in their parliament, must actually send off lots of alarm bells for not only Vance and Rubio, but maybe even President Trump, that the course he is pursuing is not very attractive. And let us also not forget that Viktor Orban was a great supporter of Israel. And I can't help think that maybe the vote in Hungary also has something to do with Viktor Orban's stance on Israel, unconditional support of Israel, which is in line, of course, with what we see happening in many other European countries, that people are moving away from this support of Israel. So was this not another wake-up call for Trump to pull out of Iran as fast as possible?
I don't believe that President Trump will have the same assessment as you. I'm sorry to say, he is very good in sort of trying to make us believe that he has an impact on everything. But once things do not go according to his plan, he will always say that other people are responsible for this. But if we look at the situation in Hungary from a point of view, which doesn't originate from Washington, I think it is very interesting to see that maybe politicians in Europe are underestimating the interest of their citizens in issues of geopolitical implication. So there is this mantra among European politicians that voters only look at issues of domestic importance. They are not interested in international politics at all. I myself feel that this is really a wrong assessment. At least I would say, according to my experience, and I give lots of presentations, in very different settings, and I see that people are very, very interested in understanding how our world in turmoil is sort of going to develop, why we are in such a difficult situation, and how we can escape from this difficult situation. So I would assume that the sort of political attitude Orban developed with regard to geopolitical questions might have had an impact on the voters' decisions. However, I also think that the fact that the EU was somewhat strangling Hungary by not giving the kind of money to Hungary that Hungary definitely needed in order for its economy to run at least a little bit more smoothly than it runs at this moment. I think this must have had also a very important impact on the final decisions that voters took when they cast their vote last Sunday. So I think that Hungary is always a very, very important country, showing us how things between East and West Europe are going to develop for the next years to come. Hungary during the Cold War was a country that always had to look for certain reform options within the framework of communism that was ruling the country at the time. It was a country that very early on tried to show that there was something possible beyond this Cold War constellation in Europe. And for that reason, I think we have to look very, very closely at what is going on in Hungary. And it seems to be more complicated than the sort of narrative we are being given by mainstream media, which sort of says that, well, Mr. Orban is now defeated because the people in Hungary want to follow Brussels policies. I'm a little bit dubious about this because I think that the structural position of Hungary at the border between sort of the Eastern European tradition and the Western European tradition sort of has always compelled this country to find a third solution, a solution which is neither pro-Russia and nor pro-Western Europe. So I think we might want to observe what is going on in Hungary very closely to test the hypothesis that maybe one of the reasons why this comparatively young candidate could assemble so many votes on his side that he now has a 2/3 majority, one of the reasons might be that he has a somewhat ambiguous policy. So a third solution, which is not the Orban solution and which is not the Brussels solution, but which is something in between. And I think this is what we should observe for the next weeks to come and then come to an assessment of the situation. For China, the fact that Mr. Orban is no longer in power is not such a very good development because they somewhat always aligned quite closely with Orban and also used Orban to make their voice heard from inside the European Union rather than from outside the European Union. And I don't think that his successor will fulfill this function for the next years to come. So China is losing somewhat an ally inside the European Union. And I think this is also true for Russia, although I would not go so far as to say that Mr. Orban was an ally of Russia. But I think Russia could count on his resistance to a policy of supporting Ukraine no matter what. And I think that his successor has now already given some signals that he is also hesitant to follow the Brussels policies towards Kiev 100%.
Well, I think there are many indications, even within Europe, that maybe things will just not go on as before because we have the whole issue of America not wanting to support Ukraine in the billions as it has in the past. So maybe there's just a general shift of becoming more cautious and pushing more for a peace solution in the direction of Ukraine. But that'll be very interesting to observe, as you say, as time goes on. This third wave, as you put it, which is a nice way of putting it, which Hungary actually might be a trailblazer. There might be a third way in other countries to come, which, of course, the people in power now are themselves not able to realize that this is coming their way. So maybe they shouldn't be so euphoric about what happened in Hungary because it could come to a theater near you too very soon, so to speak, with the next elections around the corner.
Let me say one thing. I think at this moment, the situation for the war in Ukraine is very, very complicated. And the fact that the US is still supporting Ukraine with intelligence and the data that the Kiev needs in order to hit objects in Russia is the most important support for Ukraine. And as Ukraine does not have the capability anymore to really sort of fight against the slowly but steadily moving forward troops from Russia on Ukraine's soil, Ukraine will more and more be forced to actually transfer this war to the territory of Russia. And this is a new level of escalation. And we hear already from Moscow that they're becoming very, very nervous And that now they're already saying, maybe some countries in Europe should not feel so safe because we know for sure that they are collaborating with Kiev in developing certain weapons that are then used to hit objects in Russia. So the moment where we finally decide that they are already involved into this war to a point that we can actually attack them is not so far away. And we know that inside Russia, there are forces that are actually already arguing quite openly in favor of showing to those countries that are acting as hidden actors behind Kiev that they can actually be hit by Russian weapons. And this would mean that then the war in Ukraine would be a European war. So as a matter of fact, while everybody is looking at the situation in the Near East, there is something developing in the middle of Europe that is really, really very dangerous and can be the beginning of a European war every day. If, Kiev hits a certain object and Moscow decides, okay, that's it. Now this is the last object that you hit. We are now going to retaliate and include Germany or include France or include whatever country. Then we have a European war. And I think this is something that we should not forget while everybody is watching so closely what is happening in the Near East.
Yeah, good to keep in mind. Of course, we all don't want World War III breaking out anywhere, whether it be in Europe or the Middle East. But let us turn our attention now to something that everyone's been watching, namely Trump's blockade of Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So the U.S. accused Iran of economic terrorism, but then it blockades Iran, which, what does that mean? That means it's also economic terrorism, question mark. Trump, of course, has threatened to bomb all Iranian ships and boats that try to cross the waterway in any way. But let's remember that Iran is not Venezuela, where the U.S. Navy imposed a total blockade last December on ships trying to leave the country with oil for export. So official Chinese data from 14th of April has shown Chinese natural gas imports for March dropping to the lowest level since October 2022. Inbound shipments of crude oil fell 2.8%, with Chinese vessels stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. President Xi stated, quote, "We must not allow the world to revert back to the law of the jungle," end of quote. After the ceasefire, Iran announced a 2-week passage through the Strait of Hormuz, so that would have been from the 8th to the 22nd of April, and was planning on taxing ships who come through. We have discussed that in the past with yuans or with bitcoins or whatever. Of course, it never came to that because of Trump's blockade of the blockade, but the safe passage was contingent on including Lebanon in the ceasefire, which we already discussed. Didn't happen because Israel decided to bomb Lebanon back to the Stone Ages the day after the ceasefire was announced. But since the U.S. blockade of the Strait, no ships have passed. So in some ways, it's even worse than it was before. The U.S. wants to pressure Iran to meet Washington demands, and it also wants to pressure China so that China pressures Iran to meet Washington's demands. So has the U.S. overestimated its power and underestimated China's resolve in this issue? Both China and Russia's foreign ministers have condemned the blockade, saying it's jeopardizing the passage and it's a very irresponsible move. So my question to you is, China has the largest navy in the world. Will China board U.S. ships somewhere else in the world, like in the South China Sea, for example, if the U.S. stops or boards Chinese ships in the Strait of Hormuz? And how long will China put up with this blockade? Will China pressure Iran to surrender?
China will not pressure Iran to surrender. I'm quite sure about this, even though the situation is not uncomplicated also for China. However, it's quite interesting. Yesterday, I watched a TV discussion on Chinese TV trying to assess this blockade situation. And very interestingly, expert opinion in China is that this blockade is actually not very efficient. It is more a symbolic blockade than a real blockade of what they actually said. They wanted to blockade all the harbors that Iran sort of has. And their main argument is that because of the kind of weapons that Iran still has on stock, the boats of the U.S. Navy the vessels of the US Navy have to keep a quite big distance from the Iranian coast, which implies that the nearest ship, according to their assessment, has a distance of 800 kilometers from the Iranian coast. So this also implies that the ocean is very, very big. You know, if you look at a situation where you are 800 kilometers away from the next coast, so you would have to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vessels in order to make this blockade really a blockade that is as efficient as President Trump tells us it is. So from this point of view, I gained the impression that although Chinese vessels have difficulties in passing through this blockade, or maybe in passing through the Strait of Hormuz, they do not think that this so-called blockade actually is a blockade. We should know that the Chinese know what a blockade is, because this is what they are doing ever so often with Taiwan, right? Which, of course, according to their assessment, is no problem at all, because Taiwan is only a province of the People's Republic of China, right? And it's not a question of blockading a country that is not Chinese. So I think it is interesting. And I also hear assessments from other parts of the world that somewhat doubt that this blockade that the US is pretending to have established is really a blockade that can hinder all vessels from coming in and out. Nevertheless, I think Donald Trump is again very successful in telling the whole world that he is blockading Iran, which again is also a very interesting move, because he just declared a ceasefire, right? And they signed an agreement on ceasefire. And in the middle of all ceasefires, he starts blockading Iran, which I think could easily be interpreted as not going very well with their ceasefire agreement, right? On the other hand, I think what he achieved by this blockade was that he somewhat pushed Israel into starting to negotiate with Lebanon, right? Even though we are not very sure that this has any real contents to it, at least Israel had to stop attacking Lebanon, if I'm informed correctly, for the time being. So I think that Mr. Trump is also sort of not only playing his game with Iran and playing his game with China, but he's also playing his game even with his closest ally, which is Israel, right? So we don't really know what is going on here. And I think, from my point of view, this control of the Strait of Hormuz was something that was actually sort of, how should I say this, orchestrated, or maybe one should say it was planned between Iran, Russia, and China. Iran, Russia, and China have had maneuvers near the Strait of Hormuz before the war started, not only this year, but every year for several years. So this implies that they already sort of had made plans. And I think it's quite interesting when you read the Chinese language articulations on this issue. They will always say control the Strait of Hormuz. They do not say they block the Strait of Hormuz. They control. This is what they actually sort of planned together with Iran. How can they do this? To which degree should they do this? And so I think from a Chinese point of view, it is okay for Iran to actually control this. And when I listen or read things in Chinese media, they never question that it is Iran's right to control the Strait of Hormuz. And they hint at, for example, Egypt also generating a certain income by letting ships go through the Suez Canal, right? So it is not something totally new that a country might do this kind of thing. So I've never heard anybody saying in China, because we then will have to pay a toll, therefore we don't want Iran to do this. I think that they have already agreed between themselves, Russia and Iran, that this is totally okay, right? However, I think that this taking a toll from these vessels that want to pass through the Strait of Hormuz has a very interesting implication, because it's actually those countries that need oil and gas from the Gulf region, which are eventually going to pay so that Iran can rebuild the country that was not damaged by those countries that need their oil, oil and gas from the Gulf region, but that was damaged by the US and Israel. Right. And this, I think, is going to be an issue. This is going to be an issue because neither the European countries nor countries in Asia feel obliged to actually rebuild Iran that was destroyed by the US and Israel, right? Especially if all this war doesn't lead to any solution that gives back stability to the region. So this is, I think, something that we will have to keep in mind and which we will have to observe, and one of the reasons why what we just discussed a minute ago, Europe is drawing sort of a little bit away from the US with regard to this question and also away from Israel is because they feel that they are suddenly put into a position where they will have to pay for damage that they are not responsible for. And this is also true for Japan, that heavily relies on imports from the Gulf region. This is also true for South Korea. This is also true for China, but also for Indonesia, for India, and all the countries in the Pacific region that rely on imports from the Gulf region.
Yeah, so in effect, by these actions, by the war, by the blockade, we see that the allies of the United States, namely the Europeans, Australia, Japan, Korea, they're really being hit hard. And Donald Trump was like, well, let's block the Strait of Hormuz because then we can hit China hard because we know that China really relies on all the gas coming through the Strait of Hormuz, which is, of course, true. But by hitting China, he's hitting all his allies. And let us not forget that before the U.S. blockade of the blockade, Tehran and Beijing, along with a half dozen other friendly countries, were beginning to gradually restore energy transit. Although China has been preparing for a crisis of this magnitude for months or maybe even years, with large-scale stockpiling of oil and gas, Iran's removal from its supply chain has also put China in need of finding others, and it's competing on the global market. And of course, we all know that the prices are going through the roof and not in sight. China and Russia did veto the resolution for the Strait of Hormuz on the 7th of April, which of course was put forth by, I guess, the US through Bahrain and all the other Gulf nations, more or less asking these nations to go there and defend the Strait of Hormuz themselves. And China and Russia voted against it. Of course, their veto powers in the UN Security Council. So Trump might think he's hurting China, not taking into account that in China, as we had discussed in our last podcast, has enormous capacity to replace gas with coal for electric generation, and also has very high numbers of electric cars. And Europeans are now very hard hit, as you just said. Ursula von der Leyen said the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz is greatly damaging, and the restoration of the freedom of navigation is utmost importance to us. Before the U.S. blockade, a coalition of around 40 countries, mainly NATO members, alongside Japan, South Korea, and Australia, had been working on a strategy to secure the waterway. So Trump's hurting his allies, not really China, one could say. It's important to note that each time an agreement to end the war in Iran, or at least end hostilities against Iran, is within reach, of course, Israel decides to violate it, and then you're back to square one again. So how can we come to a solution here? Because at the rate this is going, the allies of the United States are just going to turn their backs on the U.S.
Well, I think it is maybe a little bit too early to anticipate right now that the allies are going to turn their back on the U.S. because we must not forget that the western part of Europe is under the nuclear umbrella of the U.S. And of course, in this situation where Russia is really nervous about what is going on between Ukraine and Russia, we must be quite nervous, and we cannot sort of just say, okay, the U.S. is doing so many horrible things. We simply don't regard them as our friends anymore, and we give them all the possibilities to leave the NATO and to sort of leave us alone in Europe. I mean, we are not in a situation where we can develop enough leverage in order to deter Russia from using this situation in order to hit us hard. I don't think that Russia wants to occupy Western Europe. I think this would be beyond its capacities, but it is very clear that Russia, if the US kind of retreats from Europe and if Europe retreats from the US, then Russia will see the possibility of hitting Western Europe in order for Western Europe to come to the conclusion that they can no longer support Kiev, right? And this is really, really a very dangerous situation in which we are. And for that reason, also our relationship to the US has to be treated very, very rationally, even though we see that the US is doing many things that are to our detriment. We must be very cautious in reacting to this situation. And I think this is sort of something that maybe politicians in Europe are not used to, that they have to sort of invent measures that are sort of not so openly in this one direction or in that one direction. They have to be ambiguous. They have to be subtle. They have to be flexible. All these kind of things don't seem to be sort of the major instruments in the toolkit of European politicians at this time, but I hope that they're going to learn, because the situation of Europe is actually getting worse and worse. And if we don't handle this delicate situation adequately, we will run into enormous difficulties. On the other hand, I would say that it is quite clear that the US wants to make sure that not only the near-peer competitors like China will be damaged and by damaging it, contained in their further development. They also look at number 2, at number 3, at number 4 on the ranking list of the world most developed and strongest economic powers. And of course, the EU is the number 3 and Japan is the number 4. And very interestingly, when we look at the war in Iran, we don't only see that Russia and China are being hit, but we can also say, very interestingly, Europe and Japan is also being hit. Yeah? And very interesting. So these are the top countries after the US. And I think we can see from the history of the US since the end of World War II that they always have had a close eye on their near peers, on those countries that were actually quite close in their capacity to what the US economy represented. And for that reason, we see that this war in Ukraine is a multifaceted war, and nobody tells us what the reason why is, because there are so many layers of reason that you better don't talk about them, because if you talk about this openly, I think you will even have more people against you than you already have.
So you mentioned another key word, NATO.
Mhm.
So I'd like to bring NATO into discussion. And then I'd like to also bring in another very important country, which we have not mentioned so far, which is a NATO member, a very important NATO member, namely Turkey. And another triangle, namely the US, Turkey, and Israel, that relationship there, which is, of course, a very complex relationship. So after President Trump issued an ultimatum to NATO countries to find a solution to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, that was before his blockade of the blockade, Turkey, which, let us not forget, has the second largest army in NATO, said the alliance is not obliged to intervene. The NATO members reaffirmed the alliance's defensive mandate, rejecting claims from the White House that the other member states had a, quote, duty to intervene alongside the U.S., since it was the U.S. that attacked Iran and not vice versa.
Yeah.
Now, let us also not forget that Turkey and Israel have a really long-standing animosity between these two countries. It is said that Netanyahu and Erdogan just really do not like each other. Of course, Erdogan was a very outspoken critic of what Israel was doing in Gaza, of the genocide it was committing there. And then Israel called for Turkey's expulsion from NATO. And now Trump has actually said, well, I don't really like NATO anymore. It's not really bringing us because they didn't really help us. So maybe I'm considering leaving it. Former U.S. official Joe Kent, who we discussed last time, or the time before last time in our podcast, said that the U.S. might end up leaving NATO in order to support Israel in a possible war with Turkey in Syria. Will Trump leave NATO in order to avoid Article 5? Will Turkey take a lead in a lasting peace in the Middle East? What is your opinion, Suzanne?
First of all, I think that the US cannot easily leave NATO. The US is a country which is a big island in the Atlantic and in the Pacific, far away from the center of the world economy, which is the combination of Asia and Europe, because this is where the majority of people live in the world, right? So from my point of view, the fact that Donald Trump actually tried to come to a so-called normalization with Russia was actually very, very dangerous for the western part of Europe. Because if he could really relate to Russia, he would no longer be interested in the western part of Europe, because he would have a foot on the European continent by relating to Russia. Right? At this moment, we see that his plans of normalizing his relationship with Russia, at least for the time being, have not become true. So under this precondition, he actually has to watch out not to be isolated from the Eurasian continent by sort of leaving NATO and making all the Europeans think really, really critically about the US. So even though he is always telling us, that he might want to leave NATO and things like this, I think when, the leadership in Washington will come to a final assessment, they will say, for the time being, we cannot do this. So this is one side of it. On the other side, I think that from an Israeli point of view, there is not only Iran as a competitor for regional dominance in the Near East, there's also Turkey as a potential competitor for Israel. So the animosity between Erdogan and Netanyahu is sort of the reflection of a structural situation in which Turkey is a potential country that might want to dominate the region, right? And for that reason, Israel has to calculate, if they could defeat Iran, whether or not the next step would be to go against Turkey. Interestingly, Turkey is also a country that is a NATO member, at the same time strongly allied with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also interested in becoming a BRICS member. So this shows that Turkey wants to play a game which actually very much fits with its geographical position as a bridge country between Asia and especially the Near East and Europe. Right? And they think that this is a very favorable position, and they know by their history that the Ottoman Empire was actually such an empire that sort of reached out to the West and reached out to the East. Right? And I think Mr. Erdogan has told us time and again that he sort of has this utopia in mind that somehow he could reestablish Turkey as a major player, not only in the region, but beyond, and we are, people tell us that we are actually sort of going towards a multipolar world order. And this is why many countries are not trying to position themselves in their respective regions so as to be able to claim a position as a pole in a multipolar order, right? And Turkey has very definitely understood that if they not only align themselves with NATO, but also have a comparatively good relationship to Russia, also have a comparatively good relationship to China, they fulfill the conditions that at least China and Russia will not disagree to Turkey maybe playing the role of a pole in a future multipolar region. The same policy is true for India. India also pursues this kind of multi-alignment policy. And the reason why they do is because they think that by pursuing this multi-alignment policy, will they eventually be able to claim the position of a pole in a multipolar order. And Israel definitely does not want this to happen. And for that reason, from a structural point of view, we'll see that Israel will somewhat have to come to the conclusion that it not only needs to fight against Iran, but also against Turkey. So what happens if Israel cannot win the war against Iran? Or what happens if Israel cannot end the war against Iran? If they cannot end the war against Iran, it will be very difficult for them to go against Turkey. And if we come back to from where we started our discussion today, why do people in Israel think that they need a greater Israel? It's also because they think that they need to enlarge their territory and have more influence on their neighboring countries in order to avoid that Turkey can actually sort of reach out to the immediate neighborhood of Israel as yet another competitor for regional dominance.
But of course, Israel can only do this as long as the United States supports it. So it's not like it's alone making all these decisions. It's very much the support of the United States, this unconditional support and this military support that it has, which is actually allowing it to do this. One issue which we have not mentioned, which I'd like to mention, is the Houthis, another front that the Israelis are fighting. What happens if the Houthis block the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb? That's the other way for Gulf oil and gas to leave and come to the world. If they would block that, that would be, of course, be a disaster economically, even more than just blocking the Strait of Hormuz, because it would also affect the oil, the gas, the fertilizer, the chemicals, everything we've been talking about. And I interestingly heard in a podcast of the BBC where there was an insider from Iran speaking, he said the head of Iran's parliament, whose name is Blagher Ghalibaf, we saw him in Pakistan. He headed the delegation there in Islamabad. He said the U.S. should enjoy the $4 to $5 a gallon gas, which of course is incredibly expensive for the United States, because it is going to get much, much worse once the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb is blocked. Let's not forget that Bagher Ghalibaf is one of the most important politicians in Iran, and he tweeted this, actually. So should we be taking this threat very seriously at this point?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. But I mean, these people know very well that the whole world will be affected by this sort of second closure or blockade. And for that reason, they are waiting until they use this instrument. Right? So it is very, from their point of view, it is very logical that you don't get out all your instruments simultaneously, but you threaten, you show them, if you go on like this, if you sort of go up the ladder of escalation, yet another step, then we will also go up the ladder. And I think it is very interesting to see that so far, Iran has always been able to move up the ladder when the other side had moved up the ladder to reach a new level of escalation. And so, of course, they have to arrange very neatly, what is our next step? Because we don't want to run out of possibilities if the other side sort of moves up the ladder of escalation step by step by step by step. Right. And I think they definitely know that they have this instrument in their toolkit, and they will definitely use it once they assess the situation as being so that this instrument needs to be used. But obviously, they're not using it at this time.
Very, very dangerous situation. My final question to you, I want to bring China back in at the end, because we're talking about all these various future scenarios, the greater Israel, or more maybe Turkey becoming more powerful, the role of China in the Middle East. So as a starting point, let's not forget that the Israelis and also the US, but I think it was mainly the Israelis. 4 times already they have bombed very close to the Bushehr nuclear power plant of Iran. That is, of course, against international law. It's against what the IAEA is saying. IAEA is saying it is not allowed to do this. They also killed a worker there, by the way. Russia built that nuclear power plant, has now pulled all its workers away because maybe they know something we don't know. But if they actually would end up hitting it, so if Israel or the US would hit this, it could contaminate not only the air, but the water, which would, of course, devastate all the Gulf nations there. Let us also not forget that the Gulf nations were totally left in the lurch by the US. They've been bombed as a retaliation for Israel and the US bombing Iran. And China is setting itself up for a closer cooperation with the Gulf states. It wants to expand the economic corridor with the UAE and to cooperate on energy technology development and bilateral trade. And it is set to host the China Arab State Summit in 2026, where it wants to conclude the free trade pact between China and the Gulf Corporation. Is this the beginning of the Gulf kingdoms moving away from the US towards China? And is the US going to be left alone here without any allies in the region?
Well, as a matter of fact, the Gulf nations have had a very close relationship, at least some of them, for quite some time with China. And I remember vividly when the international exhibition, the World Exhibition, was in Shanghai back in 2010, if I remember correctly. It was the pavilion of Saudi Arabia that had the longest queues. Everybody wanted to have seen this pavilion. So it's China has been friendly with these countries. It has actually diversified by importing also quite some oil and gas from these countries, not only from Iran. So this is not a new tendency. It's only that now this tendency is made open, and we realize what is going on, whereas in the past, nobody actually paid attention to this. And I think it is quite clear that China very openly said that Iran should stop attacking the countries, the other countries in the Gulf region. So China is actually also here trying to use its very good relationship to these countries in order to sort of help them, whereas it also talks to Iran and tries to help Iran. And so what we are watching now is something that has been going on for quite some time between China and the Gulf states.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. I think if it's okay with you, I would close our discussion here for today. And anything else you'd like to say to our viewers?
Thank you very much for listening to us, especially as we are as we have been speaking for quite some time. Thank you for always preparing very interesting questions, and see you next week.
Thank you also, Suzanne, for taking time to talk to me again and to talking to our listeners. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning into another session of iGlobeViews. You can find all our podcasts on our website, www.iglobenews.org, or on our YouTube channel with the handle iGlobeNews. And we look forward to having you tune in for future discussions. Thank you.